Greece is only about the size of Louisiana, and even then, it's mostly mountains. And yet ancient Greece is perhaps one of the most influential civilizations in human history. You see, when starting a new civilization, you generally want to start in a part of the map that has good soil for farming, maybe a big river you can sail down, and easy natural defenses. And yet Greece is a country of small rivers, scattered islands, and barely enough good farmland to support itself. But what if I told you that's not a bug, but a feature? So how did these forces shape ancient Greece into the civilization we all know today? How did it shape the city-states that once cleaved apart the peninsula? And how did the geography of this little peninsula affect everywhere from ancient India to the modern United States? Greece is a peninsula of peninsulas, each peninsula spreading smaller peninsulas of its own like a geographic fractal. In fact, you could say the same thing about Europe as a whole, but that's a different topic. The entire reason this peninsula even exists is from the African plate smashing into the Eurasian plate, creating a sort of crinkling of the crust and pushing up the mountains and islands of Greece. You can see this in how Evia, Attica, and the Pindus Mountains all form these distinct lines with the Cyclades and the fingers of the cartoon hand that is the Peloponnese. This makes Greece, as well as neighboring Turkey, a very mountainous country, which makes the Spartan kick quite effective in combat, and gave good places for people to build easily defensible fortresses. These people are known to us today as the Mycenaeans, described by Bill Wirtz as a beta version of the Greeks, who built these huge fortresses across Mycenae, or Mykines, Tiryns, Gla, Midea, and Athens. These fortresses, or acropolis, were a bit like the feudal castles of medieval Europe, but with everyday people also living within their walls, kind of like small cities. I'll admit that's not really a perfect description, but I think it's a good analogy to help understand how things worked in this era. Although, side note, if anyone wants to make a Bronze Age version of Game of Thrones, this might be a good example to draw from. These mountains gave these cities a commanding view over vast swaths of land, where the Mycenaean kings could easily watch over and defend the farmlands feeding them and their people. Too bad that farmland kinda sucks though. You see, the mountains that made Greece in the first place not only constrict Greece's arable land, but also didn't exactly bless the country with good nutrient-rich soil in the arable land it does have. You can grow some food obviously, but as the population grew, the Mycenaean and later Greek city-states would have to import much of their grain from elsewhere, be it from Anatolia, Italy, Egypt, or as far as Ukraine. There is one crop that grows particularly well in Greece however, and that is olives. Seriously, if you go to Greece you'll see olive trees everywhere. Olive oil gave the Mycenaeans and their Greek descendants something to trade across the Mediterranean marketplace, with their civilization becoming a very outward-facing one, as traders and colonists set out all across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, inspiring many folktales which will later be written down by this guy named Homer. This trend continued after the Late Bronze Age collapse and the so-called Greek Dark Ages, with the Mycenaeans slowly evolving into the Greece we're all familiar with, and establishing colonies across the eastern Mediterranean, creating the regions of Aeolis, Ionia, and Doris in what is now western Turkey, Magna Graecia in southern Italy, and even Cyrenaica all the way down in Libya. Interestingly, the Ionians are the reason many Middle Eastern languages like Persian, Arabic, or Turkish all refer to Greece by some form of Yunan, or Yunanistan. Kind of like how French refers to Germany by the name of a tribe that lived near their borders, the Alemanni. We tend to think of civilizations as being built along major rivers, like Egypt or Mesopotamia or China or even the United States, but this is a rule that Greece couldn't follow. Many Greek cities are built along rivers, but not rivers that you can sail a barge down. At least not easily. Of course, you kind of have to develop into a seafaring civilization anyway when you're either crammed against the coastline or based on a bunch of islands, like Naxos, Mykonos, Rhodes, the Holy Island of Delos, or Crete, home to the Minoans who predated ancient Greece. I talk more about them in another video, but their trade networks, later utilized by the Greeks, stretched all across the eastern Mediterranean, all the way to Egypt. These trade links also included what is now Lebanon, a similarly mountainous country that spawned another seafaring civilization of people living in city-states, the Phoenicians, who not only gave the Greeks a writing system, but also a kind of ship called the bireme, which would evolve into the trireme, something which would be especially used in one particular up-and-coming city-state. Within the region of Attica, nestled between the Imathos Range and Mount Aigaleo, sits the Acropolis of Athens, a site so famous throughout history that you could honestly be forgiven a little bit for thinking it was the Acropolis, like how there's only one Colosseum. Just a little bit. As mentioned earlier, Athens was one of the Mycenaean acropolis that flourished throughout the Late Bronze Age. However, unlike most of its counterparts, it actually survived the Late Bronze Age collapse to become a city-state of its own. The Acropolis was incredibly important to ancient Athens, not just as a defensible fortified position, though it certainly was that, but as a sacred site with several temples dedicated to Athena. By the way, just quick PSA for the uninitiated, that temple right there is the Parthenon, the hill it sits on is the Acropolis. The main entrance to the Acropolis was, and is, the ever-impressive Plataea Gate, with a zigzagging staircase wrapping its way down the hill and into the Panathenaic Way, a bustling boulevard which extended through the Agora and toward the northwestern Thepulon Gate. Athens is also dominated by three other hills, the Areopagus, which served as the literal highest court in the land, the Philopapos, crowned by the Pnyx, where democratic assemblies took place, and the sacred Lykopetos Hill. The ironic thing about this future naval power, though, is that it was technically landlocked, but they did have a good natural harbor nearby in what would come to be known as Piraeus. However, the Persian invasions and later rising tensions with Sparta led Athenian leaders to commission the creatively named Long Walls, which stretched from Athens' Piraean Gate all the way to the walls of Piraeus, helping cement Athens' role as a naval power. But in order to build a strong navy, having a good harbor is just one piece of the puzzle. Luckily, Athens had one major ace up its sleeve when it came to financing that navy, one of the richest silver mines in the region, just at the tip of the peninsula. The silver mines at Lavrion turned Athens into a major economic power, enough to build a massive fleet, forge a powerful alliance / totally not an empire known as the Delian League, and construct many of the massive temples and buildings that still attract people to the city 25 centuries later. The mines, however, also became a very vulnerable spot for Athens toward the end of the Second Peloponnesian War, after Sparta took the mines and all the slaves that worked the mines fled the area, though they would actually help finance the Kingdom of Greece throughout the late 19th century, with its stores only exhausted in 1982.
This is Sparta. There we go, I said the line. You happy now?
In the plains of the southeastern Peloponnese is the region of Laconia, near the center of which existed 4 different villages, Mysoa, Limne, Pitana, and Kynossera, who in the 10th century BC would unify into one city, Sparta. Sparta, or Lacedaemon, hence the lambda on their shields, would spread throughout the south of the Peloponnese, across Laconia and its neighboring Messenia, growing famous for their prowess as a land-based power, as Sparta actually lies quite far inland. Okay, at least by Greek standards. Unlike most other major cities of the era, Sparta did not have city walls, existing in a wedge between a bunch of mountains. Mountains you can still see to this day, meaning that any army confident enough to besiege the Spartans would have to negotiate incredibly difficult terrain on the way to the city, and then they would have to fight Spartans. These polities, and many others like Thebes, Corinth, Megara, and Miletus, were each something known as a polis, which is usually described as a kind of city-state, but could also be thought of as a small kingdom generally centered around one particular city and the countryside supporting that city. As Athens was trying out this newfangled democracy thing, the history of which I might cover in another video, let me know in the comments if you'd be interested, the Anatolian city-states would come under the control of the rapidly expanding Achaemenid Empire by 500 BC. Athens and its fellow polis Eretria began to give aid to their Hellenic counterparts across the sea, eventually inciting a rebellion among the Ionians. It was this aid that likely instigated the Persian invasions of Greece, or the Greco-Persian Wars. First in 492 BC in an attempt to punish Athens and Eretria, not to be confused with modern Eritrea by the way, in fact those two names are actually completely unrelated. The Achaemenids tried again in 480 BC, this time in an attempt to conquer Greece as a whole, coming in from the north and swiftly taking Thessaly, and cornering a famously tiny Spartan force at the Hot Gates, or Thermopylae. Named after a settlement named after the nearby hot springs, the Battle of Thermopylae was important, not just for the symbolic last stand, but as the Hot Gates guarded the northerly entrance into Phokis and Viotia, particularly at this time when the sea went much further inland. By the way, I will show these areas on the map as I talk about them, but if you want an actual rundown of Greece's different regions, I actually made a companion video to this one on my second channel, KhAnubis Unplugged. Consider opening that in another tab if you want to learn more. The Greeks eventually won both wars, only to almost immediately start attacking each other in the two Peloponnesian Wars. And yes, there were two of them, the one that people usually talk about being the second one. Although Athens would end up losing the Second Peloponnesian War in Era Not Found BC, the city's high cultural value gave it substantial influence when nearly all of Greece was conquered by Philip II of Macedon. When Philip's son Alexander the Great went off to conquer the entire Achaemenid Empire in a decade-long speedrun, it was Athens' Attic dialect that became the basis for the Koine dialect, becoming what was essentially the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean. Koine Greek, yes, I'm using the ancient pronunciation for this one, had such a staying power in the Eastern Mediterranean that historians often divide the Roman Empire along the Eurachek line. Everywhere to the west, people were more likely to speak Latin, everywhere to the east, or south I guess, and you'd probably be better off speaking Greek. This was all but solidified in 620 after the fall of the western half, when Emperor Heraclius made Greek the sole official language of the remaining empire. You can learn more about the history of the Greek language in my video How to Standardize a Language, but I'm straying a bit. Let's go back to geography. As Alexander had put literally all of his specs into conquering and none into actually administering what he conquered, and also died before he could actually administer anything, his empire quickly split into multiple pieces, which eventually coalesced into the Ptolemies ruling Egypt, the Seleucids ruling over the Levant, Persia, and parts of Anatolia, and the rest of Anatolia being a complete mess. These dynasties would preside over an era known as the Hellenistic Period, becoming easily the most powerful kingdoms in Greek history. Greece itself, meanwhile, was ruled by the Antigonid dynasty, though even a century after Alexander, unified isn't exactly a term I would use, as many cities would band together into the Achaean and Aetolian leagues up until the Roman conquests. The inherently divided geography of Greece simply made it much more difficult to rule the entire peninsula. One notable example from later periods is the rugged Mani Peninsula, which proved a particular thorn in the sides of the Byzantine and later Ottoman empires. If you go with that cartoon hand image from earlier, Mani would be the middle finger, which it certainly gave to everyone in charge. It was such a holdout, populated by a famously militant population with strong ties to ancient Sparta, that many still worship the ancient gods well into the 9th century AD. The Hellenistic period saw a great deal of cultural fusion between the culture of the Greek rulers of these new empires and the cultures of those within, be it the Ptolemaic kings adopting the unique role of pharaoh, the combination of different gods into syncretic superdeities like Zeus Amun, or the Gundara art style in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom combining Greek and Buddhist art styles. One thing introduced by the Greeks was the Hippodamian city plan, emphasizing a division between the sacred public and private spaces, with the first two coexisting around the agora, all accessible through a grid plane of broad streets. This grid pattern, which actually got its start long before being popularized by Hippodamus and Miletus, is in stark contrast to the organic shapes seen in Athens, Sparta, or Corinth, but commonplace around later Greek settlements like Alexandria, Antioch, and even Takshila in modern Pakistan. Colonies were of course nothing new to the Hellenistic period, with the Greek polis of the Archaic and Classical eras establishing new colonies everywhere from Spain to Libya to Ukraine, though it was different from the post-Alexander model of, hey, we rule this place anyway now, might as well just build a new city here. While many colonies like Byzantium, Syracuse, and Cyrene would grow into new polis of their own, even rivaling the likes of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, most would have started as an emporium, or a trading post, like the ruins of Emportius in modern Spain. A quick note that most new cities throughout history weren't actually all that creatively named. I mean, Carthage literally came from a Phoenician term meaning new city. The years from Augustus' ascension as emperor in 27 BC to the death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180, a period known as Pax Romana, would see the longest continuous peace in Greek history, and a time when cities like Athens would be glorified in the minds of the Roman citizenry, as seen in the distinct lack of new construction projects on the Acropolis. They didn't want to spoil the place. However, Roman rule also saw a distinct shift in Greek culture away from mainland Greece itself, most notably in favor of Byzantium after its rechristening in AD 330 as Constantinople. This only continued after the fall of the western half and later under Ottoman rule. When Greece was recognized as an independent country in 1832, mighty Athens only had around 10 to 20,000 people. In fact, for a while, Nafplio was the capital of the new nation.
This is why both Athens and Nafplio have a Syntagma or Constitution Square.
Sparta would also be refounded under the rule of King Otto in 1834, harkening back to that ancient past. Unsurprisingly, after independence, Athens' population steadily grew to 400,000 by the 1920s, before skyrocketing to 700,000 with the euphemistically named population exchange between Greece and Turkey, where 1.6 million Anatolian Greeks and Greek Muslims were stripped of their citizenships and forced to resettle on the other side of the Aegean. Corinth, meanwhile, would end up being destroyed and resettled several times throughout its history. First in 44 BC by the Romans after they had sacked the city a century before, then in 1858 when an earthquake destroyed the old city and a new Corinth was founded on the coast, just a few decades before the Corinth Canal would be completed in 1893, allowing ships to finally sail between the Aegean and Ionian seas without having to go all around the Peloponnese. There was an attempt to build a canal in AD 67, but that went nowhere, and even today, the canal is actually too small for most modern cargo ships, with the canal being mostly a tourist thing. Part of being basically surrounded by fault lines is that Greece is continuously plagued by earthquakes, some of which have played a big role in their history. Some believe the story of the Minotaur was created to explain all the earthquakes that happened on Crete. In 464 BC, a 7.2 earthquake struck Sparta, igniting a revolt among the Helots, essentially the state-owned slave class, with Athens' refusal to help Sparta being one likely motivation for the First Peloponnesian War. A 6.4 quake in AD 447 toppled the walls of Constantinople right as Attila the Hun was on their doorstep. And in 1999, the back-to-back earthquakes in Izmit and Athens set forth a period of earthquake diplomacy between Greece and Turkey, with both nations sending aid to the other in what has become something of a wholesome tradition between the two. In making this video, the biggest impression I got about the geography and history of Greece is that Greek geography is just the right mix to allow a civilization to arise there, whilst also motivating that civilization to look for better lands elsewhere. But saying a country has terrible geography or good geography really doesn't tell the whole story. It makes for good hyperbole to get people to click on a YouTube video, but geographic blessings and curses are relative. Does Portugal have better geography than Mongolia? Well, try to get a large Mongol clan to feed their livestock in Portugal's rugged hills and river valleys, and they probably wouldn't fare all that much better than a Portuguese caravel on the Mongolian steppe. Greece's geography might not have shaped it to be a big centralized agricultural nation like France, but Greece isn't France. So maybe it's not about your geography, it's about how you use it. Yeah, let's end this video on that note. Sure, yeah, that works.